Daniel chapter 11, and we'll begin by reading verses 21 through 23. In his place shall arise a contemptible person to whom royal majesty has not been given. He shall come in without warning and obtain the kingdom by flatteries. Armies shall be utterly swept away before him and broken, even the prince of the covenant. And from the time that an alliance is made with him, he shall act deceitfully, and he shall become strong with a small people. Now, to set that up, I need to kind of go back where we were at. In our last study, we talked about the prophecies in Daniel chapter 11 that appear early on in the chapter, and I showed you where it specifically prophesies the rise of Alexander the Great, the Greek general, and he would kind of conquer so much of the known world, and then he would, when he died, which was very young, age 33, his kingdom, his empire would be divided among his four main generals. And as far as the four kingdoms that emerged, there were two of them that specifically affected the Israelites, and those were the Ptolemies, who were over Egypt, and then the Seleucids, who were over Syria and what became known as Babylonia. And one of the things I talked about was the way that those two kingdoms were constantly competing with each other, at war and conflict all the time. But in the long run, none of them ever gained the upper hand permanently. They would kind of just do this, one, then the other, one, then the other. And then they would periodically make attempts to have peace treaties or, sign a peace and then ratify it with a marriage with a daughter of one king and a son of another king. But that never worked either. And so that's basically verses 5 through 20. They're describing, one writer described it as an ancient soap opera, which I thought was a pretty good description. And so verses 5 and 20, 15 verses in our Bible here, actually encompass about 150 years. And for the sake of time, I'm not going to go through all of them, all those verses, because we talked about the first part of that passage in detail last week, and I went through what exactly, how accurate this vision was that Daniel received. And really, up through verse 20, the remainder of the verses are just kind of repeating the same thing, this up and down, back and forth, nobody ever wins, and it's just this constant conflict. But I wanted to go to verse 21, because something becomes really interesting, at least to me here, and I want to work our way through it. And we're going to meet a man that we've already met a few months ago. And in this vision, the angel in verse 21 tells Daniel about a new leader who is going to emerge in that situation of the conflict between the Seleucids and the Ptolemies. So again, verse 21, in his place shall arise a contemptible person. In other words, somebody who's basically worthless, right? Morally. A contemptible person to whom royal majesty has not been given. He shall come in without warning and obtain the kingdom by flatteries. Now, that's referring to the ascension of Antiochus IV. And if you remember, it was about 2 months ago, I think, we talked about Antiochus, and his other title was Antiochus Epiphanes, or the one who has the glory of the gods. And he became the king over the Seleucid Empire, and the one he replaced was his brother. His brother had died, and Antiochus IV was not the one who should have been in line for the throne. But he wanted it badly enough, and I'm taking a lot of history here and kind of reducing it to one sentence. He used a lot of political maneuvering and intrigue to have himself made king. And he started out with really limited support. Not a lot of people wanted him to be king, but he made alliances with some of the most influential people in the kingdom, and with their support, he was able to kind of leapfrog those who were in line to become king. And that's what verse 23 was about. From the time an alliance was made with him, he shall act deceitfully, and he shall become strong with a small people. In other words, he had few supporters, but he's going to become king. But you notice they're talking about the alliance, or the angel is here. He would make an alliance with people to get where he wanted to go, but he would do it deceitfully. The point being, he would make an agreement with someone. Now, if you do this for me, here's what I'll do. But he wouldn't keep his end. He would only keep his part of it as long as it benefited him. And so he gets to power. His base is kind of weak at first, but it begins to grow because as long as he was in power, he kept gaining more and more authority, and he was willing to use it. And if you jump back to verse 22, you see it. Armies shall be utterly swept away before him and broken. Now, here's an interesting phrase, even the prince of the covenant. Now, I'm going to suggest something to you, and this is not something anybody can prove. I read several Bible scholars who think that you can make a strong case for who this person is. It's a possibility, but I'm not 100% sure. But if you remember, several weeks ago we talked about when Antiochus became king and he began to persecute the Jews, that there was a lot of resistance among the Jewish people to him because he was an evil man. Now, history tells us one of the Jewish people who particularly resisted Antiochus was a man named Onias, and he was the Jewish high priest. He was the head of Jewish worship in Jerusalem, oversaw the temple worship. And so, verse 22, a lot of scholars have suggested this may have been a reference to Onias, the prince of the covenant. Not that he was a literal prince, but the covenant might be speaking of the covenant between God and his people Israel. And Onias could have been not a prince of it, but if you use that term prince as a function of leadership, this might be referring to him. Now, let me give you a little history about Onias and Antiochus and the reason they had such animosity and conflict between them. It's because when Antiochus became king of the Seleucids, and again, Judea, Jerusalem is under his authority at this time, he began what he called reforms. Other people didn't see it that way. They thought it as a really bad thing, not a good thing. But he began reforms in his kingdom where he would try to make his empire more, the word is Hellenized, which is simply a word that means to make it more Greek. He loved the Greek culture. He wanted people speaking Greek everywhere under in his kingdom, and particularly to follow Greek cultural practices. That's what he wanted. Everybody should be speaking Greek and do things like the Greeks did. And Onias, again, he's the high priest in Jerusalem. He did not want that for the Jews, and in particular, because he was in charge of Jewish worship. Now, he wasn't a perfect man, but he was faithful to the Jewish traditions. He did not want Jewish worship to be influenced by Greek culture, because the Greeks were notorious for worshiping many gods and having all kinds of pagan rituals and every terrible practice under the sun. And so Onias is saying no to Antiochus, and Antiochus early on doesn't have enough authority to just come in and kill Onias. He's still a young king. He's still getting his power base established. But what he was able to do, he came in, or had his people go into Jerusalem, and he made a deal with Jason, who's the younger brother of Onias, and Antiochus used his influence to have Onias removed from his place as the high priest and have Jason put in his place, saying, well, he's of the high priest family, he's qualified, yada, yada. But the deal he made with Jason was this: if I remove your brother, and if I make you the high priest over Judaism, then you have to change the style of worship in the Jerusalem temple. And so people will still be able to worship the Jewish God, but I want you to bring in Greek reforms, including I want you to use the Greek language in worship. Now, you have to understand, in that time of history, a lot of people spoke Greek. It was kind of like, in many parts of the world, Spanish. You may have your own language, but you'll speak Spanish. Or in parts of Europe, you may have your own language, but a lot of people speak English. It's kind of a trade language. Well, Greek was that way in this time of history. It was the language people spoke in many parts of the world after their mother tongue. And so Antiochus does this. He switches the high priest to somebody more friendly to him, Jason. And right afterwards, there's a conflict that erupts again in Egypt. Remember, he's the king of the Seleucids, and the Ptolemies are the family or the dynasty, whatever you want to call them, in control in Egypt. And there's another conflict. So Antiochus has got a new high priest in Jerusalem, and he hears what the Ptolemies are doing. They're threatening his power and authority. So he gathers his army and he heads off toward Egypt because he's going to go and do battle with them again and assert his dominance. And that's exactly what the angel revealed to Daniel in the vision, verse 25. He, and again that's talking about Antiochus, that's in the context, shall stir up his power and his heart against the king of the south. Remember, the south refers to Egypt. So in this case, that's Ptolemy the fourth, who was the current king, against the king of the south with a great army. And the king of the south shall wage war with an exceedingly great and mighty army. But he, again, that's the king of the south, shall not stand, for plots shall be devised against him. So it's really detailed, right? And this is like 150 plus years before it happens. So what's he saying there? The angel is saying Antiochus, king of the north, is going to go up into Egypt. He's going to begin to win a series of victories, mostly because Ptolemy is an ineffective military leader, and his own supporters are going to begin to not support him. That's what the verse says, plots shall be devised against him. And so eventually Ptolemy is going to be defeated. Verse 26, even those who eat his food shall break him. In other words, the people who supported Ptolemy were going to see which way the wind was blowing, so to speak, and say, okay, we're going to side with Antiochus. And Ptolemy's army, the rest of verse 6, his army shall be swept away, and many shall fall down slain. So now you've got the Ptolemies. They've been defeated in battle, but there's still a strong remnant of them. And so Antiochus wanted to establish a peace with them, wanted to make a peace so that he can get along with them. But none of his attempts to create peace worked, and that's verse 27. As for the two kings, so again, Antiochus and Ptolemy, their hearts shall be bent on doing evil. This is a great line here. They shall speak lies at the same table. In other words, they're trying to make peace, but they're doing it deceptively, right? They don't really want genuine peace. Each one wants the advantage, but to no avail. So it's not going to succeed, for the end is yet to come at the time appointed. So Antiochus's efforts are getting frustrated. Now he's back in Syria at this time, but his envoys are trying to make this deal with the Ptolemies, and they're just not cooperating. And so finally, he's getting really frustrated, and he was kind of a hothead. And he says, all right, I'm going to invade Egypt once again, and this time I'm going to wipe them out. I'm going to bring them to an end once and for all. And that's what verse 29 is talking about. At the time appointed. Now remember, they've been talking in verse 27, but nothing happens because the time isn't appointed. Verse 29, at the time appointed, he shall return and come into the south. In other words, come back to Egypt. And here's an interesting phrase. But it shall not be this time as it was before. Now, what happened before? Antiochus won. Remember? He went into Egypt, beat Ptolemy in battle, and was trying to get a lasting peace in his own favor. But now it's going to be different. He's invading again, but there's going to be a change of direction. And what happened was this. Now I'm going to give you some details, and then we're going to go to the scriptures. He goes off to Egypt. He's heading that way. And while he's in Egypt, he hasn't engaged in battle yet, a few minor skirmishes. He's heading toward where Ptolemy is, and a rumor began to spread that he had been killed in battle. And I talked about this again a couple of months ago. Then we're going to give you more detail tonight. And the Jews heard the rumor, rejoiced, and because they believed it. And so, remember Onias? We talked about him. He had been the high priest. His followers say, man, this is great news. God has defeated our enemy. Antiochus is dead. So they led a rebellion in Jerusalem against Jason, Onias' brother, and they deposed him, removed him as high priest, and reinstated Onias, and they got rid of the Greek, the Hellenic reforms in Jewish worship, and they went back to traditional Jewish worship. But if you remember the story, they got something wrong. Antiochus hadn't been killed. It was just a rumor. What had happened was this. He had been about to attack the main army of the Ptolemies, But the Romans wanted peace in Egypt because they had plans for that part of the world. And so they sent a delegation who met him on the way right before he attacked. And they said, if you attack Ptolemy and his army, you're attacking Rome. And I don't care how strong he was, nobody in that day was going to beat the Romans. They were a rising, ascending power. And they weren't as strong as they were going to be, but they were getting that. And so they forced him to leave Egypt without fighting because he knew there was no way he could take on the Romans and win. And so he withdrew from Egypt, and he was angry. He was humiliated because his forces were too weak to take on the Romans. And nobody likes, being forced to go like a dog with the tail between your legs, right? But that's what happened to him, which is exactly what the angel told Daniel would happen. Look at verse 30. For ships of Kittim shall come against him, and he shall be afraid and withdraw. Kittim is the ancient word for Cyprus, the island. And there was, at that point, and the ruins are still there, a Roman military base with a naval harbor. The Roman Navy had sent out this delegation. They caught Antiochus on the way and said, don't you dare attack Ptolemy. And that's what, again, 150 plus years before it happened. You talk about a detailed prophecy. Ships from Kittim, in other words, Romans, are going to come against him. He shall be afraid and withdraw before he can attack. But again, he's embarrassed now. He's humiliated and he's angry. And he has to go back home. And the easiest way to go back home, if you look at an ancient biblical atlas or of the ancient world, you had to go through Judea. Well, you didn't have to, but it was the easiest way. And he's already in a bad mood, right? And on the way back, he hears the news that because the Jews thought he had died, they had removed his man, Jason, as high priest, and reinstated the man he had removed, Onias. So now he's already embarrassed and humiliated by the Romans. And now he's really angered by what he perceives to be disloyalty from these Jews that he doesn't like in the first place. And so he attacks Jerusalem with his army, who also have a lot of pent-up frustration on the way home. And again, I talked about this in detail a couple months ago. I'm not going to go through all of it, but essentially he attacks the city, sets a large part of it on fire. He kills thousands of people in the streets, including Onias, for having the nerve to want to be high priest after Antiochus has said no. And then to make sure that his message was received, he sacrificed a pig on the altar of the temple, which, you know anything about the Jewish religion, that's the worst of the worst of the worst, right? He bans all Jewish religious practices, and he leaves soldiers there to make sure no Jewish worship can take place. And then he actually went into the Holy of Holies, the most holy place, and took the blood of a pig. He didn't personally do it, but he had it done, and had it scattered around to desecrate it. And then he turned the temple into a pagan temple dedicated to the Greek god Zeus. Now, let's read about this. Verse 30. He shall turn back and be enraged and take action against the holy covenant. He shall turn back and pay attention to those who forsake the holy covenant. In other words, this is the way of saying the Jews hadn't been very faithful to what they should have been doing. Forces from him shall appear and profane the temple and the fortress, that's Jerusalem, the walled city, and shall take away the regular burnt offering. In other words, no more Jewish religious practices, and they shall set up the abomination that makes desolate. That's that pig being sacrificed, and then the temple being turned into a pagan temple dedicated to Zeus. Now, in the time that he was there, and it was so awful that a significant number of Jews essentially caved under the pressure. And I understand why. I'm not saying it was right, but I understand it. And they went over to his side to spare their lives and agreed to collaborate with him. We will be loyal to you. And out of this comes a lot of so the Pharisees and the Sadducees later on in Jesus' time, the Sadducees find their origins here. They were Jews who worked with the Gentile power structure. They didn't come directly from here, but out of this. So even in Jesus' day, those were the guys who liked the Romans. They were the wealthy, they were the powerful. But then there were others who chose to resist Antiochus because they felt so strongly about what he had done and wanting to be faithful to their religion that they resisted him at great personal cost, including many of them who in defending Jerusalem against him lost their lives. And that's the last thing I want to read, then we'll have our discussion. Verses 32 and 33, he shall seduce with flattery those who violate the covenant. So those are the ones who collaborate with him. He tells them, you work with me, I'll put you in a good position, I'll make sure you do well. But the people who know their God shall stand firm and take action. Those are the ones who won't collaborate. And then verse 33, what happens to many of them? And the wise among the people shall make many understand, though for some days they shall stumble by sword and flame, by captivity and plunder. And again, I'm not going to repeat all of it, but if you remember that lesson, what happened to the Jews in Jerusalem who resisted him was absolutely terrible. Terrible, terrible things. Because they refused to knuckle under his demands. Many, many of them paid with their lives. So that's the lesson. Just explained. And the one thing that did amaze me, I'll say, the level of detail of this prophecy is stunning. And this is part of the reason Daniel is so controversial. Because there are a lot of people, including some Christians, who say it couldn't have been that, it could never have been that detailed and be prophetic. They just don't believe it. So they've suggested, well, it was written later on and presented as a prophecy. I don't believe that for a second. This was written before it happened because God knows everything. And so it's stunning if you study it out, the level of detail and the accuracy. We didn't even cover a lot of it. I just kind of gave you a run through just to kind of show you how amazing it is. So.